Exercise foresight, poor eyesight, couldn't fist fight, had to overcompensate. Learn to be clairvoyant, see around corners, read signals and warnings, interpret omens.
Broadcast from later, we are exchanging weak signals of change and trying to understand their significance. A weak signal of change is just something that we notice, an event, an idea, an issue, a development that we do not fully understand yet, but we suspect it might be meaningful in shaping futures of our lives and society. As foresight strategists from later, we're steadily tracking, tracing, soaking up, and trying to make sense of what's changing. And on broadcasts like this one, we give a glimpse of what it looks like when you're trying to understand something you don't know anything about. It's basically structured like show and tell. A few of us each bring in a signal. The rest of us do not know what that item is in advance. Collectively, we try to make sense of it. If you're listening and you feel lost, you don't understand what we're talking about, that's not a problem because neither do we. I don't know anything. We just figure it out as we go. So today on the room call, we have Valdis and friends of the show, Radha Mistry and Tobias Revell, our producer, Jeremy Glenn. I'm Robert Bolton. So Tobias and Radha are based in London and LA respectively. They both have recently rejoined Arup, a firm involved in architecture and engineering services, where they are leads in design, futures, and foresight. So we've heard a bit about Arup's new design fiction on regenerative futures called Abundance. I know you were involved in that, Tobias. We've seen the trailer, and I know that it's screened at V&A, but can you tell us a bit more about it and who was involved and where we might see it and what to expect from it?
Yes, so as part of like a bigger program of research and work around regenerative design, we in the sort of foresight team centrally in London decided to produce a vision piece that sort of talked about what a regeneratively designed London would look like and feel like, and what a day in the life would be like for someone in this world. It's not set at a particular time, but we really wanted to localize it and ground it because a lot of the discourse around regenerative design is either quite abstract or just highly technical, doesn't necessarily give you a feel for that world. And a particular interest was like looking at the values. So how would the things we think are important in our everyday life change? Like what would what are the inconveniences we take on in order to live a little better? So yeah, it's like a 9-minute design fiction. It's really well produced. I've done, a handful of design fiction films in my time and never had that much budget. So it's nice to be able to get in like proper VFX and stuff. Nice. It premiered at the V&A as part of London Design Festival at the end of September. And it'll be on a couple of exhibitions around Europe in the next few months. But if people want to see the full version, it's about 9 minutes. It's not huge, but if you've got an event or something where you'd like to screen it around regenerative design or design fiction or speculative practice, then get in touch because we'd love to send it to as many people as possible and get people to see it and get the conversation going about regenerative futures.
Cool. We should definitely follow up on that. Is there any reflections you have on the process of creating it? And I mean, I think of either like the trappings of design fiction, the things that people fall into, or how you solved any particular problems like that you solved in terms of how to express this future that you could share that were like interesting in the process for you?
I mean, I think the interesting thing was thinking about the audience. So the audience was mostly Arup. That, of course, it's a public thing, but really we want to talk to the 17,000 engineers that work at Arup, who are very, technically minded, very talented, very engaged in the subject. But what we want to do is set that vision. And often, I'm a critical practitioner, so I want to make it challenging, but I also want to make it really exciting. I want people to be excited to engage with those challenges. So getting that balance of tone right, where it's not a sort of causeless utopia where everything's perfect and we've solved all the world's problems, but it's also not like grimy and crap. It's just sort of, there are still difficulties, there are still things to solve, there are still everyday routines that people have to go through. They're just sort of coming from a different value place. Yeah. And that really, I think, brings it to life for people who are maybe just really focused on sort of the technical stuff and the technical aspects of these practices. So yeah, really thinking about a very specific audience was sort of an interesting challenge.
That's cool. Yeah, and I wonder if we've mostly evolved past the days of flat pack futures when it's these types of more corporate design fictions. You're obviously well past that. Radha, you were on a sci-fi design fiction panel recently with some luminaries of the field, Anab Jain, Bruce Sterling, Alex McDowell, Brian David Johnson, Julian Blaker, and you, a real sort of...
Don't know how that happened.
No,
I don't know
you
how
the
that
real,
happened.
the Michael Jordan of this
Oh,
1992
damn it.
USA Olympic Dream Team.
I finally
Yeah.
understand what that means.
So with you all, eagerly trying not to step on each other's toes and the mutual respect in that setting, are there any highlights of the conversation? I caught some of it. Or is there anything you wish would have been covered more?
I think Anab actually touched on this a little bit, but the premise of the panel was around how science fiction is used as a means of prototyping for design. And to me, while that's definitely true, like when I think about fiction in general, any stories of something, of a possible future, that to me is a prototype of a potential future. And it doesn't necessarily need to have the science fiction kind of moniker. And so I'm glad that she brought that point up, because very similarly to her, like my way into this was not through sci-fi, it was through architecture and kind of learning that like buildings are future artifacts. So, or reframing my perspective on how we thought about built environment as a speculative act. So that was really cool. And then just the last piece was just like, which I wish we had touched on, and I think I kind of like threw it in there as an add-on comment, was around just the language we use to talk about the future. And I think we find that even in the way we talk about signals oftentimes is like, it's sometimes hard for folks who don't come from a design background, who aren't versed in this way of thinking and conversing, to be able to latch on to the way we talk about futures, right? And so like, how can we diversify that language, not to kind of dilute, but to kind of like deepen ways of knowing, basically.
Yeah, I feel that.
Yeah.
I feel like that's like one of the main things we're always working on at From Later is just like, can we speak more regular, and can we speak in more everyday language? Can we write about these things and talk about these things as people do as much as possible, and introduce whatever jargon or other types of speak as needed. But it's an interesting challenge. I mean, it's part of like why we do broadcast From Later, is just to show that we're just people trying to figure it out as we go, as I've said. But I still get the feedback from people all the time where it's just like, yeah, I love your show. I have no idea what's going on. So with that, Udit was planning to be here today but couldn't make it. He's a little under the weather. So I brought in a signal. It's kind of a sequel. So last time the two of you were here, Erica shared a signal about how people were accusing Huawei, specifically its P30 periscope camera, that had an AI-assisted moon mode feature. They were accusing it of superimposing a moon image, or at least layering and compositing textures onto whatever image you were taking with that camera of the moon. So we had questions about the distinction between capturing a recording and merely prettifying the image, cleaning it up, versus producing a whole new image. And is that even an important distinction in our age of filters? Is it important to draw distinctions between recording, manipulating, editing, compositing, and generating images? Or is this all going to totally become blurred in our experience of image production? So now my weakest signal sequel, I came across a clip of someone called Vanessa with the IG handle Vanny Audio, where they do audio like production tips and how to use audio software, talking about a new endeavor from Adobe called Project Shasta that has some very cool audio editing features and ways of enhancing audio through noise reduction. What happens is Vanessa is claiming that there's, based on her experiments with it, there's no way that a noise reduction and EQ algorithm could work that well for changing the quality, or even that there's such a change in the qualities of the voice, and that she was becoming skeptical. So the thought is that it's recognizing the audio and then creating a different recording from scratch with an AI voice. Basically, like it's a deep fake for your own voice once you record and put it through. And I mean, I wonder, is that truly separate from a filter? Is it the same? I don't know. But the question is both about like, are these important distinctions, and just, are we going to see a lot of this as where recording and producing, generating is becoming all part of the same process? And what does that mean if our voices are being replaced, our images are being replaced, and our backgrounds are being replaced with beautiful bright colors?
I don't see why you wouldn't technically be able to do it. You know, the dimensionality of audio data isn't as complex as video or image. And we, you know, there was a thing last week about people putting selfie descript prompts into, I think it was either Stable Diffusion or Dolly, right? So they're already sort of saying me as painted by Van Gogh, and it'll be like, bam, you know, here's your Van Gogh selfie. So it's not completely unfeasible, and it sort of seems to be a useful application of the technology.
Are you all familiar with Serato? So Serato is the main software that's used by DJs along with like Tractor, but Serato basically imitates the experience of DJing with vinyl records. It's been around for years. It's like for that style of DJ, that's like the main tool that people are using. And it essentially allows you to like scratch and beat match and do everything you would, but using MP3s or whatever. And they've had some amazing advancements now that, you know, you can basically do it from streaming services, do that same thing from streaming services at this point. And with Tidal, it maintains like as good or like CD quality basically. And they just introduced something which is been happening, I guess, since the Kanye stem player. That's apparently a very impressive stem creation utility or function, where you can break down into the individual sounds, hear the vocals of basically any song. So it's a pretty remarkable tool for DJs and producers and remixing, and it allows you to mix in different ways by cutting out vocals as you want, or adding drums in a certain place, or, you know, in terms of the blending that you would do, or in terms of creating mashups, or, you know, whatever else it might be. So, I mean, as the outcome, we'll probably have some really horrible and some really amazing mashups and mixes coming. And there's questions of like, how long will that last? Like, are people going to be okay with this tool for lots of cool creative copyright infringement? It's kind of, yeah, Lawrence Lessig, like the new evolution of what's possible here.
Like, no amount of AI can cover bad taste. I mean, that's a part of the problem, right? Is that if you don't actually have any musical taste, you're just augmenting bad taste, which is probably. I got into an argument about something, a corollary to this. I get into a lot of arguments on LinkedIn with people posting like images from the future. It seems to be like a cross that I've decided to die on. And someone was drawing an equivalent between like calling up an image from Stable Diffusion of like a future city and using a synthesizer. It's like, it's going to, you know, the same way synthesizer revolutionized music. And my point to that is, it's a bad metaphor, because you don't walk up to a synthesizer with no musical understanding at all and go, give me a great song by Talking Heads, right? That's not how it works. You have to still understand music and the construction of sound and how it all fits together and feeling and everything else. And so there's a next question I feel going through all these sort of signals you brought up around like this sliding barrier between creativity and automation, right? Which is a big thematic consideration that seems to be going around the AI field a lot. And it's a sort of, I guess what I'm getting at is, it's a bit of a false stick to me, because you can automate the hell out of anything. It doesn't actually change the creative aspect of it. Mm-hmm. You know, you could have really creative prompt engineering, or you could have really crap prompt engineering. There was an interview with the guy behind Midjourney, who used to be of hand wavy interface, forgotten the name of it. He was saying when they were trying out Midjourney for the first time, people would go up to it and go, "Oh, this is cool, give me a dog." And they get a dog. And they go, "Oh, wow, cool. Can I get a pig dog?" And then they get a pig dog. And then they'd be like, "Oh, that's nice." And then that's it. Because it's no replacement for the actual quality of imagination or creativity.
Totally. Often the most interesting things happen when these tools break, right? Like, everyone had opinions about auto-tune at one point, and, you know, it got interesting after Cher, and then T-Pain, and then Lil Wayne, and then like everyone who was using it wrong, basically, and then the different ways you could use it wrong was when it got interesting. So
my question though is, like, doesn't this happen with any tool that starts to automate part of a design process? You could argue that we've had conversations like this when AutoCAD first came out, and when Revit first came out, and when Adobe dropped Photoshop and like all the other parts of Creative Suite, where it was all of a sudden kind of automating parts of a design process that had for ages before that been done by hand, been done manually, right? We were painting, we were drawing, we were rendering shade and shadow by hand.
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, and I guess my bigger question then in this particular case is, does it matter that, if this is the case, that it's not manipulating, changing, correcting, pitching, like your voice, but replacing it with another voice. In some way, it's just weirder. Like the fact that it can kind of recognize the words, all of it, and then instead of like altering it or removing something from it or anything, it's recreating it from scratch with some understanding about what you would want removed or added.
So maybe the more disturbing piece is like there's like a diminishment of agency in your representation.
Maybe.
I'm just curious because like even recording on Zoom or like, you know, like when we used to record on like cassette tapes and stuff like that, like it wasn't giving us back an exact replica of our voice, right? There was some like augmentation there.
That's a good point.
Because
is it different at all?
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering is like, is this just another technology where like we still just can't get to 100% of like human behavior? There's no way we can completely copy that. And so this is just another way in to get kind of close.
It's a great point. Like you could argue that this is not even different from using the telephone, that when you put a signal into the telephone and it comes out the other way, that is no longer your voice. That's a reproduction of it or something. It's hard for me to know. I'm not an audio expert, like how much this matters. Intuitively, you know, it does seem a little different, like with the moon one, where it's like if it's replacing the moon or it's adding a layer, like adding another image onto the moon, and rather than just running it through a filter.
In the first instances of recorded sound on sort of drums, the people who went to see the performances, because they were really hard machines to come by, were convinced there were like women hiding behind the curtains. And it was women specifically because of the nature of the amplifiers. The amplification method meant that lower pitches wouldn't carry. So it had to be female singers recorded, like sopranos, because otherwise they wouldn't record. And they were convinced that there was someone faking it, right? That it was a fake. It was someone else stood behind the curtain near where the machine was that was sort of singing, you know, back to it. And we see parallels all the time. You know, Jeffrey Sconce has this great book called Haunted Media about how in almost every new generation of media is like a suspicion of fakery, that it's somehow like a trick. You know, people in the US when TVs were coming out were convinced they were hearing voices through the walls, and the lead in mirrors was picking up radio signals that people could hear in their bathrooms. Like there's always this perception of trickery, and it's always tied to this sort of this disconnect as the technology is stabilized in society, where we don't understand what it's actually doing and how it's working, and then at some point it's normalized and we're fine and we get it and we're okay with our voice being replicated or being replaced with someone else's voice. And I suspect, you know, I'm sort of extending, I guess, Radha's argument. I suspect it's just part of the journey of the form of the data through different recording media as it's about efficiency and latency and things like that.
But I think the difference is that we know it's happening. Like I think we've gotten to this point where folks understand how things are being manipulated, at least at a basic level. And so
to a degree, there's also like, we're still in a world where we invent stories all the time, right? Like everyone's like, my phone's definitely listening to me because I'm getting targeted ads. And no amount of science showing that it's not and that actually your browsing data is really good at telling people what type of person you are, will convince people their phone isn't secretly listening to me.
But I have a phone that I don't use to browse because it's my work phone, and I still get weird things on there.
Shared accounts, shared data. Anyway, we invent myths all the time.
Yeah, I guess that's fair. I just think that like we're at this inflection point where we know so much more about the way certain machines or like automation patterns operate around us, and so we kind of feel like something has been taken away from us, whereas before there was such a veil over so many of those processes that like folks just didn't know, right? You just didn't know any better. And now you can go on Google and be like, oh my God, is this augmenting my voice? And you can find like 100 different articles that with information or misinformation, you know, to kind of make the case for what you believe in.
I mean, there's also like, I don't know if you folks have seen Holly Plus. Rob, you must have come across Holly Plus by now. I mean, you're a music person.
Wait, what was Holly Plus? I've definitely heard of it, but I'm...
Holly Herndon's platform.
Sure.
That she made where you could use her as an instrument. So it's using machine learning to use her as an instrument, which is essentially the same thing, but for an artistic purpose. Because they frame it as more than just her voice, right? It's not just her voice, it's her musical oeuvre, it's her musical presence used as an instrument by someone else. And it's pretty, you know, and part of it is Holly Herndon's and Matt Dryhurst's sort of politics of openness and things like that, and sort of sharing and the sort of their sort of utopian. I'm misrepresenting them. Listen to their podcasts; they're really much better at talking about their sort of worldview on technology and things than I am. But you know, it's part of that thing is saying the voice is a component piece of ourselves that we can sort of digitize and share and use.
Interesting. There's a term that's from by R. Murray Schafer, who's this Canadian composer and theorist, big for popularizing the idea of soundscapes and acoustic ecology and sound marks as opposed to landmarks. But this phrase I always liked that he had called schizophonia, which was also kind of got to this hauntedness idea, and it really meant just like on the phone, the separation from your voice, the source of your voice, and the reproduction of it. But it has this underlying feeling of anxiety, of madness, or the reference to schizophrenia in it. And we see that in films like about reproduction, about like Ringu and stuff like that. That there's something in that. You've got work dealing with these ideas. And I don't know whether the voice in particular is even spookier or something like that.
Do you guys remember how actors and actresses in Hollywood were trained to speak the transatlantic accent? Like they were trained to speak in a particular manner in old Hollywood. It was an accent that didn't exist, but anyone who operated in the old Hollywood space were trained to speak in this way, right? And now there's so many articles around how kids are on some level not being fully raised by Siri and Alexa and stuff like that, but they are interacting with these machine voices at a very young age, and they're highly impressionable and they repeat everything, right? So I wonder if there's a moment where a parent could record their voice using a device like this. It augments their voice, or children grow up hearing these augmented versions of human voice, which don't necessarily mirror real human voice, but mirror the AI version of a human voice. And it develops an entirely new accent in a younger generation whose primary interaction model has been with the Siris and Alexas of the world. Does that make sense? Did you guys follow that thread? I don't know.
Do you mean that? Because there's a trope quite often in films, you see it in Mission Impossible and stuff, where they need to fake someone's voice, and so they say a few words into a device, and then it can just replicate anything that person says, right? It changes their voice.
There's that.
Is that sort of what you mean?
There's part of that, but it's just as more and more voices become augmented, I wonder if with technology like this, we don't just have the Siri voice or the Alexa voice, but you can really, right now you can kind of modify by accents, right? With Siri and Alexa, you can be I want a British accent, I want an Australian accent, whatever. But I can imagine a world where parents can actually overlay their voices on these devices, and then children hear that, and because they're maybe interacting more with the devices than their own parents, for me, my kid spends 8 hours a day with our nanny, right? And she spends the rest of the time with us, but there's so much of her waking life that she's not with us, that as she's now developing speech, I am noticing the words and the sounds that she's latching onto, and they're not all from me or my husband. And so I'm just curious to know, will there be a AI version of a transatlantic accent with just this new generation of kids who are growing up with machine automated voices? I don't know. It's a reach. I just was thinking about it.
I don't think it's a reach. I mean, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the voices are so quickly becoming more real and more varied that there might not be a specific one. It will have that effect probably. But whether the early generation that grew up with the slightly more robotic sounding Siri voice will have that, as if they're using it a lot, they may.
My very good friend Wesley Goatley has done lots of work on this. There's lots of intentional design into the voice of Siri and Alexa to make them very subservient and very female. Obviously, the original ones were female, but they're toned in such a way to be non-confrontational, to be unchallenging, to appear to be subservient, because they're positioned as house servants. So, there's also a whole gender politics in there about the environment you're creating for your kids. Although, the opposite is true for me. I'm quite excited because my daughter goes to nursery in deep South London. So I'm really excited about coming home and having a really rich South London accent. It's going to be much more fun, I think.
Cool.
That's hilarious.
So one last little detail on this before we judge whether it is noise or indeed a signal. Someone commented on this video that I'd watched on Instagram that Shasta, this program, is just a dumbed down version of something that's coming out apparently called Neon, that's based on a project called Lyrebird in Australia and Mockingbird in the US, but basically that this technology is coming from the DoD, and it was a project by SRC and other collaborators. But yeah, military innovation defense complex there, which maybe is to be expected from what could easily be either new impersonation or just new recording. That's like the thing that scares me about this filtering a lot. It's just like, oh, any recording, you'll easily be able to isolate whoever you want to hear what they're saying from. Like, there's very hard to muffle yourself in a public space and not go heard if it's being recorded or whatever. And I guess the articles about Amazon's ambient home surveillance have been the latest on that.
An example often comes up with this stuff around deep fakes, which was that when deep fakes were first proliferating, people thought, this is the post-truth era, everything's going to go nuts, we're going to have fake politicians everywhere. But we didn't, because people who are already willing to believe conspiracy theories don't need an elaborate post-truth, deep fake. They're happy with like some janky collage of Bill Gates and some needles, right? And they'll believe that story. So it's like, we obviously as critical thinkers go to the worst, but then if you think about, obviously these types of technologies are already going to be in use by the DoD and by the world's various security agencies and whatnot, and that's fine. And Siri was also a military technology before it came to iPhone. That's just part of the way that innovation now works since the sort of 50s. But I think we jumped to the extreme end at the cost of being like, actually, it's quite argy to get to like isolating voices.
It's a great point. One person with like 2 pseudonymous accounts on Reddit and a bunch of other sort of easy believers is enough to create a dangerous movement, a meme stock, or
exactly
to blow up a new band or whatever. So fair enough. So signal or noise. Valdis, I'll start with you and feel free to jump in with any other thoughts on it.
I feel very ambiguous. I have no idea. Like I'm actually looking up what it is because I'm still a little unclear on like what it does. But if this is correct, it takes out things like gaps and ums and things like that from your speech. That's like one of the things it does.
So that's a different feature, I think. There's a bunch of editing like that that's doing automation. That's a cool feature that it does is it will give you the text and allows you to just edit the text, and it will edit it to what you want it to say, which is, I don't know how smooth that'll be. Could be good for like your first round of edits or something, or if you need to do something quickly, or if you just don't have editing skills. I think that's a cool change to the interface, and probably it can cut out the ums and things like the verbal tics in an automated way. But no, the claim here is not either of those. Really, that the whole voice is generated as from scratch, basically. Like, it hears one thing, it knows the words that are being said, it kind of mimics the tone and does it in a clean way. So it's like, and they're saying, like, the company is, Adobe, I guess it is saying that it's like noise reduction. That's been a feature on audio technology for decades, but it never worked that well. This one works so well. People are saying that it's not taking noise away or filtering noise out. It's creating the voice. It's selecting what it thinks you want to be heard, and like whatever the lead sound is, and recreating that from scratch without the noise, without the additional background noise.
I'll just say I'm not a signal because I don't understand what that leads to or what the speculative side of it is. I know like there are instances of, Tobias brought up like the deep fake thing, but I saw people doing like audio synthesis of people's voices as like a scam. So it was like your brother calling you or like your boss calling you and asking you for something. And I'm just thinking like, man, if I ever get scammed by like a deep fake dad, just like how uncanny and uncomfortable that experience will have been for me. So I mean, I don't know.
Yeah. Tobias, signal and noise. I'm
going to go signal because anything that happens to music is always a signal. Because as Radha's best friend Bruce Sterling always says, what happens to musicians happens to everyone. So even if it seems a bit tertiary at the moment, I think that the technology always trickles down. It always has an impact and always reshapes culture because everyone listens to music.
That's great. Are musicians always the first beneficiaries and victims of?
Oh yeah, because it's the most fragile and easily affected sort of market, isn't it? Because it's so sort of on the edge, in terms of its margins. So they'll jump on anything like record labels to make more money.
Radha, what do you think? Signal or noise?
I think signal. because I was able to come up with a really cool future. No, I think that Tobias's point, I think it's something that we see it in music to me, or like any kind of art to me, like that's operating at the fringes. Oftentimes, that will have wider implications for society. We're just not seeing it yet. So I think there's a there.
Cool. Tobias, what's your weakest signal?
This is really like off piece, right? Because I'm going a completely different direction. I'm excited by the new genre that I currently am the only adherent to, which is breezepunk. So there was a paper published that I saw in a newsletter by some scientists at Nanyang University in Singapore, where they managed to create a wind turbine that could basically power like sort of 1 to 3 to 4, 5 volts of power. So like basically like a small sensor or a couple of LEDs. And it's made from really available materials like aluminium, polystyrene, copper, and Teflon. It works very similar to how like a dynamo on a bicycle works, through traction, but it's sort of pushing a block back and forth of polystyrene in the breeze that then is giving a very small amount of power, and obviously any excess power can be stored. This is quite interesting just aesthetically, because obviously the push for green energy, a lot of the sort of world building aesthetics around that have been big power pieces, big stock imagery of like huge fields of photovoltaics with the sun blasting off them, or these huge swooping wind turbines, all in rows out in the middle of the ocean if you're in Britain, because we refuse to build them on land because of some reason that no one's really sure of. So you've got this huge powerful imagery, but now this imagery is quite interesting because it's a lot more DIY, it's a lot more small scale, and it's a lot more like how we have like maybe mini photovoltaics all over the place at the moment, right? So on top of light posts and parking meters and all sorts of stuff, they're all over the place. So I had this image in my head as soon as I read this thing of like tiny little wind turbines, because at the moment this model they had is like 15 centimeters, I think. But this is the very first thing, and you could imagine this really going down to sort of 2 or 3 centimeters big, picking up a really small amount of wind. It only needs 2 meters a second of wind in order to generate power. So we don't need like huge gusts out in the middle of the ocean. We need, really small everyday wind will power, a small light or a sensor. And yeah, it was just really interesting to me. It was just really exciting to think about both the miniaturization of it, the challenge to the sort of aesthetic of green technology and how it looks. Mm-hmm. The idea that it's really cheap, it's nothing fancy, it doesn't require any amazing materials. You could probably build it from stuff you can find in your house with the current model, obviously once it's commercialized. Mm-hmm. And just the sort of the way it might impact the city and the way you might walk around the city. Photovoltaics, we're quite used to seeing wind turbines in a bigger scale, in a sort of windmill tradition. But it's also the look of this sensor is very different. It looks a bit like a sort of old horn that you might find on like a car from the early 20th century.
Yeah.
I found it really interesting. I found this sort of approach to it really interesting, but mostly I like the small scale of it-ness. I like the fact that it's, it's something that you could imagine just proliferating as a standard component that's attached to sort of street furniture or things around the house or whatever it is. You might put them on your windowsill because they're quite small, and they just generate like enough power to make a sensor work or a light or something. And it's this alternative future to the big, powerful, set piece green energy future that's obviously being pushed and should continue to be pushed because that's competing against the big power fossil fuel future. But I like this idea of like the smaller, cuter, weirder, fluttery. I imagine it's quite fluttery.
Yeah.
So this is breezepunk, everybody.
Yeah. So and breezepunk is your coinage.
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, that's good. It's about time. We need a new punk. I can see how this will could feel more actually punk. It's funny that sometimes when you search like solar punk and stuff, you get these like kind of dull green images. Like it's not necessarily as much of it. A lot of it is not as punk as it was when the genre began.
And as a Londoner, solar punk is quite not super relevant to our microclimate,
right?
But breeze definitely is. Breeze is a real thing. So I'm like, yeah, breeze punk.
Can you harvest grayness in any way?
But just imagine like I can imagine walking around my local streets and just seeing these tiny fluttering, flickering objects hanging out of windowsills and on top of parking meters and everywhere, just doing like little bits of power generation, right, all over the place, and really bring it to life.
Like little lightning bugs and butterflies. It's quite lovely.
Yeah,
it's such a sweet future. I feel like oftentimes the way we talk about the future is like it's like big everything, like big data. This is small. It's cute. It's tiny.
there's a real point there, which is that we know the cost of renewable energy has dropped incredibly over the last 10 years, just like by hundreds and hundreds of percent. It's sort of almost incomprehensible. And for those lucky enough to experience the Inflation Reduction Act, you're about to see this huge explosion of green technology as a result, because it's all sort of baked into the framework there. But even wind power and photovoltaic still require quite a bit of expertise. They still require quite a bit of technical stuff. So you need scale in order to make it affordable to do, right? You need scale in order to be able to afford the expertise and the raw materials that go into it. And the nice thing about this particular experiment and design is it doesn't really based off technology that's been around for 100, 150 years, which is, a dynamo sort of mechanism. And it's just a very careful selection of materials to make it as light and delicate as possible, so that it's as responsive to as wind as possible and captures as much energy as possible. And it's made, like I say, with available things: aluminium, copper, Teflon, polystyrene block. And so it's sort of pointing at this idea of a very available and very sort of grounded version of energy generation at home. It is very much in that sort of California 70s tradition of photovoltaic.
So could you imagine like popping over to your local home improvement shop and picking these up? Like,
yeah, totally.
Is that the saturated version of this?
Yeah, or even coming as attachments, right? You could see them coming as pieces that, maybe like if you've got an outdoor garden light or something, it's sat on top, like gathering power as you're going along, or maybe it's used as a part of a charger for something. It could be a regularly available component. We're already starting to see that with solar panels. You can get sort of solar panel chargers quite quickly and easily.
Like the buzz of cicadas.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
of course,
I wonder if there's like the buzz of like these little fluttering energy conducting objects. Like if that becomes a new like sonic landscape of our world.
Yeah.
I kind of like the idea of that.
Is anyone familiar with Timothy Mitchell's book, Carbon Democracy? He's this anthropologist, political economist type figure out of Columbia. He wrote a book on how energy infrastructures throughout the 20th and 19th centuries determined the shape of like the political sort of structure that would sit on top of it. And so when you had coal, you had like very specific concentrations of resources in a location that required like huge amounts of manpower that could then also be like disrupted through strikes and things like that. But then the shift to oil changed that, because you don't need as many people to dig oil out of the ground. You actually just need like big machinery and infrastructure. And so like it's less liable to be disrupted by organized labor in the way that coal was. And coal also needs like railways, and railways are easier to sabotage. Whereas oil is like moved around partly through pipelines, but also through ships and things like that. And so when you're on a ship, unlike a railway, you can kind of go to many different ports. You don't have to follow the same routes. It's harder to kind of like interrupt it and whatnot. But he also, I think the book was written in the 2000s. And so he was kind of thinking about what the next, I don't know, paradigm, if you want to call it, of like energy was gonna be. And there was that gap between like nuclear advocates and the more renewables side. And he made the point that nuclear is something that can be quite concentrated and controlled, and so it's kind of favored by people who want to have that level of centralization and control over a resource, versus solar and renewables, like by their very nature, are more distributed, and so they're kind of harder to concentrate in any one set of hands. And that's kind of what the breezepunk made me think of. Like, what is the political economy of breezepunk because of that, the shape of the infrastructure for it?
I mean, what I was alluding to at the moment, the imaginary of green technology is a lot of it is coming from fossil fuel companies, right? Because you get your greenwashing campaign where BP will do their big, here's all our solar panels in a field, here's our big thing. And it is still about, we're the ones doing it, we're the ones in charge, we've got the control, and outside of the main grid, plenty of people cope without requiring centralized control of it. And so there is like an imaginative leap to make into a space where it's like, oh, you could just have your own power. And it actually goes back to what I was saying about our film. It's inconvenient, but it's a good type of inconvenience to have to manage to sort of deal with your own power. Mm-hmm. There's a great paper by a guy called Tatum, which I've been banging on to everyone about. He looked at, I think it's J.W. Tatum, he looked at why people in California in the 90s or 70s decided to put solar panels on their house when they could have easily gotten to the grid. Like, why would they go to the length of doing something that was much more complicated, much more difficult to achieve, required a lot more maintenance, required a lot more expertise, required a lot more collaboration with other people to share sort of tools and knowledge? versus just plugging into the grid. And the root of it was a technology that enabled them to act on their values. And so much technology, even in power, is about getting us to the commodity without experiencing the values of that technology. In the same way we were talking about, audio generation for music earlier. You're getting straight to the product as soon as you put that prompt into the AI machine, rather than going through the process of actually understanding the tools and developing a sense of musicology and everything else in your own practice. So the interesting thing here is, like, how can we get everybody to think, actually, power generation should be something I'm deeply connected with and should understand and, have a real social engagement with, not just something I plug into the wall.
It just made me think, what's really punk is being inconvenienced, and opting into that is like as punk as it gets now. Like, opting towards that. I always talk about like the convenience gun to my head or something, in terms of like, I have a choice, but to not take the flight or order Uber Eats or do whatever. But I don't really have a choice. They have the gun to my head. But so I kind of like the idea of just like grounding towards that. And I think the values is a really interesting thing, because there's all these things in life, whether it's helping neighbors and that are not convenient, but actually are about certain types of values, and that we would probably be better for and happier for participating in.
Yeah, and Tatum writes in that paper about that the people doing this, they're not coming from the same culture. They're not all hippies, or they're not all like new age people. There was young couples who wanted to, live in a different way. There's sort of elder folks who are a bit suspicious and have some conspiracy theory bits and bobs to them. But they're bound together then in a social contract where they've all decided that this is something that's important to them and a value they want to live. And I feel like things like this breezepunk joke that I'm making, are like an easy way into it, because it's not a big expense to make one of these things, or to potentially buy one in the near future if they ever became a product. But it opens the door for starting to understand your relationship with energy, because even a breeze can power a light. It's not something that has to be over there being done by BP or by Big Solar or by whoever. It's something you can do and you can think about.
Those like Montessori like play kits for kids?
Regrettably, yes.
Where they like learn about, we've subscribed to one. I can imagine like a Montessori like play kit that helps children like understand the relationship to energy and to becoming like energy independent. Like when you're 18 months old, you start to, or 2 years old, whatever it is, like, you start to learn how to build these little generators or these little breezepunk devices. And I feel, because that's where it starts, right? It starts like you start embedding values through the making and learning and observation as a child. And over time, you realize, like when you're a child, you kind of realize like, oh, energy comes through this thing I've plugged into a socket or whatever, right? And like, that's where electricity comes from. But like, if we completely flipped that model and said like, no, that's not where electricity comes from. You have to make it by harvesting it through the breeze that comes through our backyard or whatever. Like, I think that starts to become really interesting. And to me, there's something quite lovely about that vision of like these tiny futures.
Like foraging classes, but for electricity.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Like how fun.
The poetics of it is really great. So, okay, maybe to play a devil's advocate role for like a few questions. One is like decentralization isn't always better. It doesn't always work. And so there's like issues with like if standardization and things like that as well. Like what I thought of was like, how there's all these issues with like cable adapters and stuff like that, but like if you can't find the right adapter to the breezepunk device that you have, we are going to have to carry around like a bin of 20 different adapter devices and things like that. There's a benefit also that comes from a certain kind of like centralized control. Certain things like work better, and the political economic form of it isn't like set in advance. It's kind of, we can shape centralized things to benefit us as well. So that was kind of one thought I had. I mean, maybe the point is just that it's like an interesting poetic sort of flight of fancy, but like from an engineering perspective, I wonder if it has that issue. And maybe this has changed and maybe this is wrong now, but a while ago, people were saying that like the use of paper bags and canvas bags was like a lot less efficient than plastic bags. And so like actually plastic bags were more environmentally friendly from a certain perspective, even though they don't biodegrade, but the amount of kind of like embodied energy that it takes to create it, et cetera, was so like scales of power less that it was actually from one perspective more efficient. And so it made me think of that too. Like, are these devices like incredibly inefficient? We're just going to have thousands of them, but they're going to require so much resources just to power like a little calculator or whatever at home, right? Something like that.
Yeah, certainly we've heard a lot about that with solar panels these days, and depending on who's making them and where and so on, they can be pretty bad in terms of the environmental costs of production of the panels and the waste at the end of the day when they don't last.
I don't think it's an either or, right? I don't think it's like you're either living off grid or you're living on grid. I think it's an augmentation of your experience of the infrastructure you're engaged with all the time. And, we've already got, certainly in London, in the streets around me, we've already got little photovoltaics everywhere. They're on top of lampposts, on top of traffic bollards, they're on top of parking meters, they're sort of proliferated as a sort of standard way of powering small things, to avoid drawing on the grid or even having to dig up the road and plug something in. So we can, you can already see that as a potential use, and it's just augmenting this variety and introducing this choice. This prototype is like super early stage, right? This is just showing the concept that you can, from a 2 meters a second breeze, get 3 volts, right? Mm-hmm. So once that's refined a bit and sort of reduced in scale, you could definitely see it being more optimized.
Is the opposite going to be something that they're talking about too? Maybe it's too early to know, but like, why not making giant windsocks that are
because heavier things tend to not get picked up by the wind as easy.
I guess so.
The smaller and lighter it is, the easier I think it's going to be to sort of get pulled around and pushed around. So that's probably
okay. But we're having so many that it does take up space, I guess, and using it efficiently in a larger space.
I mean, there's a lot of maths in that paper that are incomprehensible to me. Maybe someone else on this call knows a bit better, but I imagine there's like a scale at which, it's a bit like, I don't know, this is really a strange thing, I know, but like there's some insects that are so small, particularly certain species of wasps, that the air basically becomes a liquid. They treat the air as a liquid. They're that sort of small. That's how they travel. They're basically swimming through the air. So I think at scales, the physics of wind are probably different. So at a bigger scale, a wind turbine is maybe a more appropriate form of gathering power, whereas at this scale, it's this sort of dynamo system.
That's fascinating. Okay. I didn't know that about wasps either. That's also like...
Mate, I spent 2.5 years studying wasps really intently for a funded project. I know a lot about wasps.
Oh, really? Okay.
Early Revell project about abiogenesis.
And this may not be that related. I just recently saw a story about sort of asking what's going to happen to the infrastructure of like highway fueling stations as we move into electric vehicles more so, and just thinking about whether there's any implication, because you basically just need the plug now as a fueling station, and what will change about highways and just that whole infrastructure of, here it's like the combination Tim Hortons Wendy's, I think, if anyone's driven through Canada, is sort of like the thing, but different. You have these different, depending on what nation or continent you're on, these different...
Pizza Huts in the US, isn't it? Documenting Pizza Huts being turned into other things.
Pizza Hut, Taco Bell.
On the highways, or what's it?
Yeah.
There's a Pizza Hut, Taco Bell combo.
Anyway, yeah. Those are just an interesting thing, but maybe we'll see lots of tiny windsocks or whatever there. Signal or noise, Radha?
Signal. That's all I gotta say.
Okay. Valdis?
Yeah, I'll say signal I think the poetics of it was like really well explored by Tobias and Radha both. And then I think the political economy links are interesting, and I don't think there's any like fixed corollary or form between like centralized good, decentralized bad, or vice versa. So they can kind of, the range of like things that can be built on top of it is quite open-ended, and I'm curious, but they're linked, and I'm kind of curious to think about the links between energy infrastructure and political economic forms.
Yeah, agreed. I'm super curious about that, and I'll say signal as well. Radha, what's your weakest signal?
Okay, so I'm like a lurker on TikTok. I never post anything. I just watch things, and there's these like videos that have been popping up on my TikTok stream thing over the last few weeks, which is these humans, real life human beings, imitating non-playing character or like NPC kind of movements throughout the real world, right? So like one video will be like, go on a first date with an NPC, and it'll be this like woman in a floral like dress, even like the expressions in her eyes is as if you were interacting with like a Sims character or something like that. Like there's not like direct eye contact. The the movements are kind of like flowy like this, you know, according to the laws of gravity in these virtual spaces. And like she'll like speed up and then slow down and like wait for you to come and then speed up and part of it. This one particular couple, they're dancers, and this is like a dance style that they're kind of like inventing. But there's another side of this, which is to say that like we are taking behaviors that we have learned from virtual space and now bringing them into the physical realm. And that to me is really interesting. And especially as we think about things like the multiverse, and we think about like, you know, what Meta is trying to do with virtual spaces and things like that. Like and then there's the whole like simulation theory, right, from like 2003, which is like we live in a whole simulation, and it keeps coming up on my feed, and I keep thinking like there's something weird here, and I can't put my finger on it, but I don't know if it's just like a new gestural system by which we interact with our environment, kind of like what happened when the iPhone came out, right? And you saw, you know, like 2-year-olds going up to glass windows and like trying to swipe and pinch and zoom because they had seen that interaction model on a mobile phone, or if this is just like a new dance style. There's no real significance to the real world.
Yeah.
I don't know, but it's just I can't get it out of my head, and I've been obsessing over it for weeks, and I need you guys to just be like, all right, Radha, this is bullshit.
I think it's significant in some way. There's a bunch of things come to mind. One is when we were on that speculative design panel together, Tobias and Radha was my favorite of the various projects that we saw was the labor dance it was Japan 2050. And so that just dance as cultural memory and is interesting, and sort of LARPing as cultural memory. And in that case, the concept was they were in a world where people no longer needed to work very much due to automation and AI. There was a dance that had been created that was like, you would be like dancing as though you're bringing boxes around or something like that. Here, my mind goes to like what would it be to be mimicking old video game gestures and things like that, and the NPCs that, especially for me, I'm going back, like the further you go back, the weirder and more interesting it is, and it's kind of the more real they are, the less interesting. I also think NPC in itself is sort of a strong signal, the way that it's used in slang. So there's that as well, like the fascination with the ordinary, and with this idea of NPC. In some ways, it's like the most insulting thing you could say about a person. Maybe some people would not take it that way. I don't know. But there's a lot of just interesting culture all bound up in this. And I like the idea of like dances based on the trees in Mario or something like that, as the dancing trees in Mario, that is, as part of this.
Yeah, it's like an interesting reversal of machinima, isn't it? You know, like going from making movies that are somewhat true to life in video games to making true to life, and I'm using air quotes through my blue background, into video game structure, right? The video game logic. It reminds me of a lot of the work done looking at like Minecraft and what Minecraft does to kids' brains once you've got that sort of logic and you're sort of applying it to real world scenarios about sort of connect to this logic, you know, cause and effect. This thing does that thing does that, and therefore I approach all problems that way. It's not a bad thing, it's just a different way of approaching the world that's learned through Minecraft. And I wonder if it is a way of approaching the world through a video game lens, in the same way that we all sort of role play a little bit as we're going about life. I'm sort of reading the Days article now, which is very well researched and in depth. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, it was. But that's the thing that feels a little eerie, is like the way that, like, if you watch the videos, they're not making eye contact. They're making eye contact as if they were an NPC, right? Which is like not to directly look at you. It's kind of like to look off a little bit. And so it's like all of those, learned behaviors that manifest in real life, then like what are the implications of that on the way we start to behave in society, where this feels like a very like explicit example of video games augmenting our behavior in the real world.
I don't know if maybe not augmenting, but at least influencing. Yeah.
Influencing.
Also, it's like providing the grammar. Like, it's interesting that we didn't really have a concept for a lot of this until video games were fairly mature, at least in culture, for like that everyone's using, and in language that everyone's using. So having NPC, like I'll, be out walking and see the same person twice, or somebody that kind of seems like they're just walking around the block or something like that you're never going to actually interact with, for example. It just sort of seems like an NPC, and we have some language for that. And the only analog I think of for that would be what's called fifth business in like literary theory, and referring to like Shakespearean characters, but it's a little bit, it's not the same as an NPC. Fifth business, I believe, would be like characters who have lines, I think, have a bit of a role, but don't move the plot forward, and are just kind of there. It's pretty close to what you would call an NPC, I think. But there's not a lot of language for that, and I don't know that anyone would call someone they see fifth business. So, or whether, but there is a, I think Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead. I think there have been plays where people wrote, like, made them the main characters or something, made fifth business characters the main characters, and that's like another interesting next step. Like, what happens when you take NPCs? It's probably been done. There must be fan fiction about NPCs from different games.
Oh yeah, for sure. But I mean, in a video game, almost all the characters are NPCs, right? So they're, you know, especially in like a single player role playing game, so they're all there to sort of push your story forward. There's a great I think it was by Jody, the sort of French digital arts collective, did a thing about Max Payne, you know, the sort of classic amazing shooting game. And they sort of they walked through the camera through the world of Max Payne, which follows a linear path. Your character follows a linear path, always going forward. It's not an exploratory game, but they did it backwards. And they showed like how much of the architecture and the positioning of things was just set up purely for your single perspective as you move through this world. It was not built for anyone else to navigate. It doesn't make sense from any other angle, from any other direction. It doesn't make sense to travel through backwards. You know, basic stuff like the signs aren't pointing in the right way. You can't see, you know, various entrances and stuff. And it's sort of this point about it being a simulation that's meant to feel like an open exploratory world, but is constructed to give you a very on rails linear experience of that exploratory world as you encounter all the NPCs, most of whom you're killing because it's a shooting game. But yeah, it's an interesting, I mean, a lot of video game art has looked at these sort of issues, right? Of like, you know, Haroon Farouki is probably one of the most well-known. His works Parallel are all about looking at where the edges of the game world are and where they start to encroach on our world. Like where, you know, in the distance you've got this beautiful forest, and as soon as you get to it, you realize it's all one tree that's been duplicated and shrunk and grown and changed so many times. So this fiction, this suspension of disbelief you have about it being real is sort of broken at those points.
That's part of why the simulation thesis that Radha, you mentioned, I just never found it convincing at all, because it's like, it's so obvious what the difference is, which is that in the real world, there is no end to the complexity you can discover by investigating something. It's just, it continues and continues, and we haven't even reached the bottom, right? Like quantum mechanics can't broach like the level that it's at. Like it can't get any deeper. But it knows there's something there and it can't get there. So that experience in like computational simulations doesn't happen at all. It's like, it's quite obvious. One thing I thought of to bring it back to like, what's the effect that it has on us? I think as Rob, you were talking, I thought of the idea of like Foucault at the end of his life. He was thinking about this idea of techniques of the self. And so the ways that, I mean, he was thinking in ancient Greece, there was like a proliferation of different ways of kind of constituting your subjectivity through meditation and prayer and other practices and whatnot. But then in the modern era, there was stuff like journaling, which was like a huge part of how we ended up constituting our subjective sense of self. It emerged like partly through these instruments we have, right? So we have paper, we have pens, we have paper that we can waste, right? Like it's not a scarce resource. We can write whatever we want to write. And we get this deep sense that we're very unique and individualistic. I feel like social media, the impact of it is the complete opposite. It's like, wait, this feeling that I have that I think is personal is shared by like 3 million people around the world, or like this perspective, this photo that I'm taking has also been taken by like 800,000 people in the past. Like the things I think are unique about how I see and feel the world are actually part of this like pulsating collective human experience. And I actually think it's quite beautiful. It's not like, I think people usually use NPC in a kind of derogatory way. And I know that they mean it in a like humans are very programmed and blah, blah, blah. And they're not, you know, critical and they're not thinking. But actually the idea that some of our deepest, most personal feelings kind of sit somewhat outside of ourselves, I think is very exciting to me and very like promising and hopeful. That's what makes me quite hopeful about social media.
I agree. I mean, we've talked a bit about my views on memes and the idea that when you get to a meme that says, you know, that feeling when blah, 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 hashtag relatable, it feels special. It feels like poetry. It feels like something that, that's profound, like in particular when it's not something that people usually utter, you know, when it's just this shared thing that seemed like it was unique to you maybe, or you didn't know if it was unique to you.
As you know, you mentioned that this is an interesting artifact of the digital impacting the real, and I was sort of going to go that, you know, that's sort of, you know, that's a sort of well-documented phenomenon, you know, that the new aesthetic 2013 plus thing of this idea that we're starting to reshape the physical world to resemble the digital, because we have to put it, so much of it back into the digital, right? We have to make it digital legible because it's got to be re-recorded. So we structure it in a certain way, you know, we get our ring lights and everything else to make it more friendly for the computer to process. And so there's an interesting thing there, and that's happened in image production, it's happened in fashion, it's happened in putting barcodes and everything, QR codes and everything, whatever it is. Some of it's very literal. The ordering of, you know, autonomous cars are being trained mostly on streets with grid systems because it's easier for autonomous cars. New cities now designed around grid systems in like, you know, neon, in order to make sure that, or in the form of neon before it became a super studio project, to make sure that they're autonomously legible. And so I wonder, this is just another artifact of like all those scientists who spent 40 years trying to get the movement of the human body right, and dancers are like, no, we'll just come to you. We'll go your way. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about trying to replicate our movements. We'll change our movements to make them easier to animate, you know? And there's loads of work in CGI about how increasingly, particularly in like high-end cinema, like Marvel stuff, the actors are directed for CGI. That's not just putting on a green suit. They're directed in such a way where the CGI cutting and dicing later will be easier. So they're embodying and playing the fiction of being in the CGI in a way that's really sort of different, you know. There's classic things like putting on a wire or whatever, but even down to types of movement, the way they're lit, the way they're meant to look, you know, when to blink, all that kind of stuff. Ted Kim, who's an amazing former DreamWorks guy, writes an amazing amount of stuff about, like, again, the tragically racial dimensions of bodies in CGI, but also the way that bodies are sort of captured and represented, and things like skin and movement and muscle and hair and everything else is trying to be replicating computation at the same time as studios will hire actors who don't have complicated, for instance, afro hair, because it's hard to replicate in CGI if they have to put that character in CGI.
There was a game I bought for, I think actually for my mom for Christmas, which was like, Hey Robot. Do you know this game by Frank Lantz? He's a game designer at NYU. And it was basically a game where you would have a word and you would ask smart home speakers questions to try to get it to say that word back to you. And what the interesting thing was is that you had to kind of try to make your questions legible to the machine ways of interpreting that question, so that it would kind of feed you back that answer. And it kind of revealed the ways that we're already, shaping our behavior, our way of speaking to fit, these kind of machine-driven ways of perceiving us and whatnot, right? And turning it back at us. Which kind of made me think of some of the stuff you were saying, Tobias.
Yeah. It's all very like You Are Not a Gadget, Jaron Lanier stuff too, it feels like.
There's also this stuff just like around movement that I think is really interesting. Like, because movements are not natural. Our ways of walking, our ways of speaking, our ways of swimming, our ways of running, eating, sleeping, these are all like things we learn to do in particular ways. They're not set in stone. We're not born with them. We kind of shape them, we learn them, and they change over time, right? Like, I mean, you can notice it very easily, like difference between how men and women walk typically, right? Like those are learned ways of walking, right? Ways of moving your hips, ways of swaying, et cetera, et cetera. And like Tobias was saying, I don't think it's that we're mirroring the technological side. That's the interesting part, but there is something in that interaction that I don't know, maybe this is like where the conversation started, that I'm not sure what the meaning of it all is, but the ways we like experiment with our ways of inhabiting the world and moving through it is interesting.
You were mentioning like the Hollywood accent earlier, and, you know, in the UK, we had the equivalent, which was the BBC accent. So you had like BBC English, which was what all the sort of presenters had. You know, it's just a shared cultural code that's then inherited by the generation that's whatever is the dominant financial sort of economic generation at the time, usually our generation. And this is the next one, right? The cultural code isn't the voice on the radio or the voice on the cinema. It's the movement of the bodies in the games they grew up playing that they're nostalgic for. I think that's the root of it, and that's what's interesting. Is this is is a new cultural code in the same way that my parents' generation wanted to speak BBC English, or taught in school to speak BBC English in some cases. This is a cultural code. It's about the movement of the body, and it's something that's shared. It's people can get the reference because they've all seen it together, and it's something that identifies a culture.
That's funny. Myself and Jeremy, who produces broadcast from later, in just like putting some of these things out there, or the various conventions that we use, it's sort of, sometimes it's our self that grew up on the internet competing with our self that grew up in television media or whatever, in terms of which like formats and conventions to pull from and what makes sense and communicates. So those are funny, tensions in terms of just normal ways of acting and communicating.
When I try to understand like what art does, it suspends the termination of action into some kind of like particular use. And so it brackets like the usefulness of stuff. And so if these dancers are exploring new ways of moving, it's not because it serves like a particular function, but there's something more experimental and uncertain with where it could lead. Like the idea that it's like a shared cultural code is interesting, but I want there to be like something more to this example. Like there's something that we don't yet know or understand about what it means to experiment with those ways of moving, like without knowing where it goes. Like it doesn't terminate in a particular like usefulness or something like that.
Maybe we're just getting ready to be able to communicate with robots, you guys.
To walk with them, to blend in.
To dance, that's a better...
Yeah. To dance with robots. Mm-hmm. Connecting to an earlier point you'd made, Valdis, just around, both bodies and movement. And I was just thinking of the fact that the other thing that exists is a lot of lore and mythology around the right way, like, or the more natural way that you should be squatting and you should be doing different things, standing which way. And there's so much information about the different even stretches you can do. There's just so much more information available online about how to could be fix your body or how to stand, run, all of these things that they just was just not nearly as accessible for most people before. And it's interesting. That's like some competing notions, but the things that are often that people will claim are natural may not feel that way because of exactly the point you were making, that it's so much of this is actually learned and about fitting to certain conventions of behavior. Signal or noise, Valdis? I
think it's great. I think it's such a fun thing to think about and talk about. I'll say it's a signal, sure. But I don't know if it pretends like some kind of big change in anything. I think it's just like an interesting artifact or phenomena to think and talk through.
Mm-hmm. Tobias, what do you think?
I'm going to say a noisy signal because I think it's part of a bigger piece, which is the growing role that video games as the world's biggest media form will have over the writing of cultural codes and forms of interaction. This is a nice novelty and it'll start as a joke, but then it will go in. Actually, I was looking at it and thinking what's more interesting is the fact that they put the green diamonds above the heads, which is something you would only really know and understand what that means and the significance of it if you're familiar with the game. And those sorts of semiotics will start to, I think, increasingly go into, everyday experience of products and services as a whole generation of people that grew up on video games start to create those products and services. So I think that's what's interesting is the sort of cultural codes and interactions that are written in this.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's so funny. So with language in particular, I've always held the majority of new slang that emerges in the popular culture, let's say, and gets adopted widely, usually filtered through the internet, has origins in hip hop culture or Black American culture. And recently, I feel like my sense, and this is all just sort of my sense, is that maybe it's definitely still the case, but shifting towards video games being the source, and where things like just the words for cool, like cool, has its origins, I believe, in Black American culture, or dope, or whatever else people are saying. And now I recently came across people like saying OP, meaning like overpowered, which is a video game slang for Yeah. So and that was new to me, and maybe it's well established, but it's just like these things growing so much and having nuances. So it's just like an interesting different source of new popular vernacular that comes from one place, spreads through the internet, and emerges in everyday life. So I'll say signal.
Watching the NPC videos like more closely just now as you guys were speaking, I was just like, oh my God, the amount of energy that it takes to control the body that way. And actually it makes you realize that like the joke that NPCs are just like easy to program and blah, 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 like they run like automatically. It's like the complete opposite. It takes like immense amounts of effort and work to maintain yourself in that form for a human.
Ian Bogos has a really brilliant aphorism, which I use a lot, which is things that are really easy in cinema are really hard in video games, and things that are really easy in video games are really hard in cinema. So, for instance, you can have a character in a film, put a t-shirt on, no problem. But try and do that in a video game without it clipping through the body or going all janky or the cloth physics jumping all over the place, right? So there's a scene, he writes about this in The Last of Us 2, there's a scene where you as a character can grab a rope and wrap it around stuff. You could just wrap it around anything. It's a remarkable technical achievement for a video game to have this soft body object that is completely manipulable as it would be in real life. But in real life, it's really hard to, for instance, blow up a city or have a horde of zombies and make that on camera, right? So it's this really interesting dichotomy between what we expect and all the workarounds. I saw a great performance in the Netherlands, which was similar to what you were describing, Valdis, where it was a group of performers being robots, and they were dressed up as robots and had makeup on. And they very slowly moved to the center of the room to where the audience was sat, lay down, and then very slowly sat up again. And the strain of doing it meant their makeup ran from the sweat and from the energy. And that was the whole point, was that this sort of robotic movements took such incredible effort that it sort of destroyed the whole visual visage was sort of broken by the end of the performance. It's pretty cool.
That is cool. Broadcast from later.